Hey guys, Lumen02. I'm going to do a quick old school video on this interesting deck. I think stuff like this has been done before, but this is basically Jeskai or blue-white splash red weenie. So the point behind the deck is to, through a density of creatures, overwhelm control decks in the format. So what kind of decks is this card good, or what kind of decks is this deck good against? It tends to be the deck variants. So I built to play against that matchup with that deck in mind. You'll note we don't even have Swords to Plowshares in the main deck. We only have Lightning Bolts, Chain Lightnings, and Fireballs, and Control Magics as opposed to Swords to Plowshares because all of those are more proactive. They can either go at face, or they can acquire you a better threat like a Juzam Jin or an Urnam Jin or a Sira Angel or something along those lines. So, the way the deck's constructed, it has a very light mana base. It only has 18 lands in it. It runs a full complement of Cities of Brasses, 3 Plateaus, 3 Volcanic Islands, and then 4 Tundras and 4 Strip Mines. Note, no Mishra's Factories in this list, and that possibly could be an oversight, but because it's a 3-color aggressive deck, I really wanted to ensure that the mana was very good. Now, I make an exception with Strip Mine because oftentimes, if you're putting them back, going back yourself is not a huge issue. One of the few reactive cards that I am running in this deck is Disenchant, because I think Disenchant is probably, and this is a bold statement, but probably one of the most powerful unrestricted cards in the format. Now, it probably goes somewhere between Disenchant, Lightning Bolt, and Swords to Plowshares, but I think Disenchant has a very important function in this format, and it answers so much. That I think, it tends to be, I find it to be more important in most matchups than even Swords to Plowshares. That's why I went with the proactive burn plan at the low end. So you'll see this deck has an exceedingly high volume of 1-drops, 21 to be exact. We're running 4 Acacian Chevaliers, 4 Savannah Lions in white. Of note, they're also not Arabian Nights cards. Running 4 Flying Men and 2 Unstable Mutations, which are kind of templated to go on to the Flying Men. I didn't want to go all in on Arabian Nights cards, even though I do have 8 plus 4, 12 targets that die to City in a Bottle in this deck. Correction, I think it's actually 14. So 2 Unstable Mutations, the 4 Cities of Brass, the 4 Flying Men, and the 4 Serendib Afrits. Really, I tend to find that Unstable Mutation, I only do it if my opponent's tapped out, and I know I can use it as like a Lightning Bolt, and then I don't really care if it dies afterwards, if the creature dies afterwards. 2 Chain Lightnings, 4 Lightning Bolts. I'm not running all 4 chains. I kind of just found that I didn't really want all 4 of them, but it could be possible that I want to cut 2 White Knights and put in 2 Chain Lightnings. I haven't done enough testing with the deck, and this is more of a predatory strategy in general against control. Going into the 2 spot, like I said, I am running 4 Disenchants in this deck because I think Disenchant is just so crucial. It gets Mode, it gets the Abyss, it gets Blood Moon if you need to. It gets a lot of Artifact dudes. I mean, Artifact dudes just tend to be big, like if you have like Workshop style decks, or Stasis, or Winter Orb, Juggernaut, Trike, but Trike's kind of done its work if it resolves. 4 White Knights. White Knight is just a good rate in the color. I'm not really sure if it should be White Knight. I just couldn't find the right creature for the 2 spot. It could just be that it should be 2 Knights and then 2 additional Chain Lightnings and possibly look to cut 1 Tundra and increase by 1 Volcanic Island in the land count. Also, Time Walk. You'll note that I'm not playing Balance in this list because I think Balance is going to be exceedingly horrible in a deck that has 21 1-drops in it, most of which are permanents. I'm also running a playset of Serendib Afrits in the list, 2 Control Magics, which is kind of a hedge against the creature decks, but it's also a much more proactive answer to creatures than Swords to Plowshares. It's obviously slower as well, but Control Magic, all of its progeny thereafter is always going to generally be a 2-for-1 unless it gets like Red Elemental blasted or something like that. And then 2 Fireballs. Fireballs are kind of just for finishing, and sometimes you can use them as board sweepers or to deal with stuff that has toughness 4 or greater. In the sideboard, 1 Divine Offering, rather not Divine Intervention. That was an old meme deck that I recently did coverage on. 2 Dust to Dust because I do think this deck has troubles against Mishra's Workshop based decks. 3 Swords to Plowshares, 3 Blue Elemental Blast, 3 Rebs, 2 Energy Flux, and another Control Magic. The Control Magic could switch over to Swords to Plowshares. At one point in time, I was trying Earthquake in the list, but I just wasn't a fan of it. Could also try Shatterstorm, but I think Shatterstorm's less oppressive than Energy Flux is. And oftentimes, the stuff that we really care about that's artifacts, Energy Flux already deals with, and the stuff like Triskelion that we really, really care about has already done its job by the time it resolves. So if you wanted to get like Triskelion or stuff along those lines that you just don't want to resolve, you'd probably have to use Artifact Blast, but the card is just so bad. That unless I was on like Arabian Aggro, where like all of my threats were Arabian Nights cards, I probably wouldn't want to run that very much. Anyways, guys, this is the deck. Like I said, it was templated and built to beat control decks, the deck variants in the format, and I'm going to go into some quick coverage on how it does in that regard. Alright guys, so game 1 is really not that interesting. I just get exceedingly lucky. Like that's all this is luck. I have a Black Lotus, Ancestral Recall, land, and 3 1-drops. I do think I sequence this poorly. I know what I'm going to do with this. There's pretty much no chance I'm going to do anything but play all of the 1-drops, so I sack it for white. There's no way in heck I'm going to play out Serendibifreets here, or a Serendibifreet with the mana, because I'd rather not have 1 Swords to Plowshares target. I'd rather their Savannah Lions and have 1 additional land. My opponent bolts one of my Savannah Lions and casts a Time Walk, goes to their draw step, probably doesn't see the land they want to see, and then just goes ahead and concedes it. So, I think of my opponent, they just, they lost because I got lucky is what happened here. I had a bazillion 1-drops, which is what the deck does, and I had a Black Lotus and Ancestral Recall. Like I said, I do think that the proper sequencing was to not sack Black Lotus there, but there is pretty much nothing that I would cast over all of the white 1-drops that I have in my hand. So I just went ahead and did it anyways because I didn't think it really was that relevant. Did it pre-Ancestral. I suppose there's like a world in which maybe I draw a Flying Man and a Time Walk, but that's actually, I think, worse than just casting out, 5 power worth of dudes on turn 1 with an Ancestral. So anyways, guys, quick pause. I'm going to go to the second game. The second game's actually interesting. This one's really not interesting. It kind of just shows the swinginess of 93-94. And, it's a thing. I mean, 93-94, there is a lot of luck involved because the power level of cards just varies so highly. All right, guys, we're back. And let's go over this keep. So, this is probably not a keepable hand. I'm on the draw, and I probably could have value mulliganed to this hand. This hand does not have any permanent sources of damage. But I actually, obviously it doesn't show it as long in the replays, but I actually thought about it for a while. 1, I wanted to kind of try the hand, and 2, I kind of thought, what's my opponent's range after having seen my deck in game 1? What's their range of keepable hands? And the range of keepable hands probably has some number of like lightning bolts or swords to plowshares. We know at a minimum they're playing bolt, and they had a multicolored land in the first game, so I don't put them off of swords to plowshares as well. So my thinking is like I'm going to keep this hand because it has enough mana to cast anything that it may draw. And going to 6, even if I have a 2-threat hand that has 2 to 3 mana sources to cast them, which is pretty much the entire hand minus 1 card, is possibly not even better than this because my guess would be they probably have a large volume of removal in their opener if they opt to keep it on 7. Because I think they would value mulligan down if they didn't have like a balance, swords to plowshares, lightning. Like if they had 2 removal spells or like 1 balance, I think they're probably going to keep. And if they don't, they're probably going to look to mulligan unless they have like Ancestral Recall and they go for like a high variance kind of like YOLO play and try to draw. So I think this is an acceptable keep, but it's not exciting. And we're going to have to look to chip away at them with damage. So we're hoping to draw threats pretty much exclusively at this point. And if not, we're going to have to go to the long game. I don't draw a threat here, so I opt to start throwing burn at their face because I really don't. I don't know if they're playing like Serendibifreets, but this player, Chateau 9, tends to play like the deck variants. This is more of like a Jeskai control deck, but it's kind of like the deck. It may be minus a few cards. I throw the other Chain Lightning at their face here, and then I'm going to hold on to the Lightning Bolt at this point, and then leave up Disenchant. Like I said, I think Disenchant is definitely worth inclusion, even in the most aggressive decks like this deck is, because it deals with deals with Moat, deals with the Abyss, deals with the Jame Day Tome, Disrupting Scepter, etc. And you can pitch it in a pinch to blow anything up if they try to Time Twister or Wheel of Fortune, which makes it pretty decent here. They play out a City of Brass, which I'm not upset to see. I like them taking damage off of their lands. I'll try another Disenchant, and right now Disenchant is not looking so hot, and I don't have a clock, and I'm kind of just sitting here on this Lightning Bolt, waiting to draw a threat. I'm pretty sure most of my threats are probably just going to die as soon as I draw them and play them, but I'm going to play for time. I draw this Fireball, and at this point, it's kind of a turning point in the game for me because my strategy for how I intend on attacking this game has just changed. Now I intend on trying to draw all the cards out of their hand with my threats, my permanent threats, because I want to eventually resolve this Fireball. My guess would be they probably have like 1 to 2 counter spells and 1 to 2 removal spells, but they probably don't have great card draw in their hand, like a Jame Day Tome or something like that, because I think, given the board state that we're currently on, they would have tried to lay a Jame Day Tome, and my guess is they probably sideboarded some number of the Jame Day Tomes out of their deck because they're just too slow against a hyper-aggressive deck like the one I have. So I really want to protect Fireball and use it to be the instrument of how I end this game. So you're going to see the rest of my plays kind of lead up to that. I go ahead and disenchant this on their upkeep to see if they want to counter it, because they missed a land drop last turn. They miss a land drop now, and my hope is that they start discarding. I go ahead and strip mine this, although it's possible I wanted to save it for Library of Alexandria, but I really don't want to leave anything in my hand. So if I play it out to get a Library of Alexandria, they just won't play it, and they'll wait till they draw their own strip mine and then strip mine my strip mine, possibly at the cost of 2-for-1 advantage off their lands if they can get up on Library. So it's possible I wanted to hold it, but my other thinking is if they have a draw 7, I would prefer not to have any permanents in my hand because I would rather, have used them at that point. And the only card I would lose to a draw 7 right now is Fireball. Ferocity of Brass. This draw has not been working out very well, so we're kind of just playing the long, slow game. We're going to try to trick them out. They're very high on cards. We're pretty equivalent on mana. I'm up 1 mana at this point, which is not generally where you want to be as the aggressive deck. But it also isn't that big of a deal because I know I have Fireball to fall back on. I just need to be very careful about how I expose it to their counter magic. So we continue drawing lands for a while here, which is not great, but they're also not really doing all that much. Which means to me that the creatures, when I do start drawing the creatures, which there are many of them in the deck, I believe there are 28 permanent sources of damage in the deck, are not long for this world. So I just play a Flying Man out. I figure it's going to get bolted or, chain lightninged or plowed or something like that. They time walk, but don't cast anything else relevant on their turn. I could have seen, maybe a Jame Day Tome or something coming down, but they didn't have it, so they just kind of use it as an Explore here, which I don't think is terrible because, as time goes on, my deck's going to continue to, play more and more threats. So maybe exploring into, a Mind Twist or something is not bad. So they have 2 removal spells for my first 2 threats, which is not, that makes complete sense. I would assume they probably had some number of those 2, or maybe both those cards in their opener. I go ahead and just cast the Serendib of Freed out. It gets counterspell, but I do get a damage off of it down to 13, which every point's going to be relevant here. They go ahead and Mana Drain my Jin, or my Efreet, rather. And, I wait with bated breath to see if they'll cast anything on their turn. They do not. So, again, I'm just trying to look to build up to this Fireball. I'm not going to use my last Disenchant on their Mox, because I know that Moat and Jame Day Tome and Disrupting Scepter are all possibilities within their range for their deck. Although my guess would be they're probably only running 1 Disrupting Scepter and probably 1 Tome at this point. Play on a White Knight. White Knight, of note, is impervious to the Abyss, which is one kind of cool thing, but it's very unimpervious to Lightning Bolt. So it eats a bolt and dies, and this is kind of just going as expected. I actually debate on casting Time Walk, but I don't here. I want to save it for a threat and see if I can get an attack step in with it. So I'm saving the Time Walk because I don't have anything going on my board, so I would be solely using it as an Explorer. And Time Walk in an aggressive deck like mine actually has the ability to be very board or game impacting because you can get 2 attack steps in or an attack step in if that's what you're looking to do. I draw a Serendib of Freet here. There's also a strong possibility that they could be running some number of Red Elemental Blasts in their deck as well, or Blue Elemental Blast. I draw the Black Lotus. I don't know if this is correct to play it out, so this is actually a pretty strong debate on my behalf. My worry is if they do hit a draw 7, because I don't think they're going to want to cast a draw 7 for starters, but if they do, my thinking is Black Lotus is better on the board. Additionally, if they want to blow it up with a Disenchant, I think I'm okay with that. But I don't know. It could have been more correct to leave it in hand, so I could have saved it for Fireball. So I don't know on that decision. I may have thrown it out there too quickly. It may have been more correct to save it. Draw a Strip Mine. Now this is another debatable play on my part. I play the Strip Mine out. Again, my thinking is like draw 7s. Like I don't really want a draw 7 to happen and then not be able to react to it or have maximum amount of mana to react to it with instant speed effects like Lightning Bolts and Disenchants. So that said, I do play the Strip Mine out, but I think there's a lot of credence to actually keeping the Strip Mine in hand, because if my opponent does draw into a library of Alexandria, which would be kind of backbreaking at this point in time in the game, then they're just going to Strip Mine my Strip Mine, and I'm going to Strip Mine one of their other lands, and they're going to play a Loa out and start drawing a bunch of extra cards. So I think there's a pretty strong argument to keeping it in hand there as opposed to playing it out. And we're basically just playing draw go. But one of the things that we have an advantage on is that we're a much more threat-dense deck. So as time goes on, we're going to draw more and more threats. Realistically, they probably have like 3 to 4 Lightning Bolts and 4 Swords to Plowshares. But when you count that up, it's 7 to 8 cards that template against 28 cards in my deck. So they're going to have a tough time dealing with it. So realistically, they probably need some sort of mass removal like Moat or Wrath of God or the Abyss to deal with all of the creatures that I have. They go ahead and disenchant my Black Lotus on my upkeep. I just go ahead and sack it to Ancestral. At this point, when Ancestral resolves, I think that I'm probably in the clear to start just playing creatures out because they don't appear to have counter magic. I think typically speaking, they'd probably in general counter that spell, but they don't counter it here. They disenchant my other Mox. I throw a Bolt at face and get in there for 1. Now, I have another strong debate here on my second main. I do end up playing the Lion out, although there's an argument here, right? Because if they have balance in hand, which is a reason that they would allow me to attack and then play more creatures and not counter any of this stuff, they could want to balance here, and post-Ancestral Recall, my hand size is going to be the largest that, it's going to be from this point forward in the game. So they're thinking it could be like they're going to allow these creatures to resolve and then try to balance me. But I do think it's still correct to play the Savannah Lions out there because if they balance, they're going to have to discard more cards. They're really going to discard down to 2 cards, which leaves me with a Fireball and an Unstable Mutation. Now, Unstable Mutation is basically a blank, but Fireball is very, very important because, like I said, when I drew that, I was like, all right, this is how I want to win the game. This card's going to be the card that wins me the game. So I want to build my whole plan around it, which is basically like, try to put them into 4 situations where they need to deal with the board, and when they tap down low, and then eventually just get them. So they go ahead and they cast their own Fireball here, and blow up all of my dudes, which is fine. It's a lot better than balance for me because it means that they're going to be tapped low on mana. I go ahead and throw a Bolt at face. They do not counter it. They allow that to resolve. Now, I go to my main, I go ahead and kill their Volcanic Islands. They don't tap it for mana, which is fine because I would just go to second main if they had. I tap all my lands with the exception of 1 City of Brass, cast the Lightning, or the Fireball for 6, leaving up Red Elemental Blast to template it against their counter spell that I assume they have in hand. They go ahead and Blue Elemental Blast this, and I think, well, if they have all Bebs in hand, or if they have 2 Bebs in hand, then I guess I just got had. But they're at least at a minimum at 4. But as it turns out, the Reb is just barely enough. It's enough to take me over the finish line here with my Fireball. So the first game, pretty uninteresting and kind of, when you have a Black Lotus, Ancestral Recall, and a bazillion 1-drops, kind of how you'd expect a game to go against Control if they don't have balance in their opener. But this game was actually, the second game was a lot more interesting because we kept a much more dubious hand that I think was really only defensible based on the range of what I assume my opponent would try to keep. I figured a lot of the cards they would template against the matchup would be less relevant in their opener, and possibly we could even get them to go to discard phase, and over time I could build up, to a situation where, I could accrue virtual advantage. But I knew that it was going to be a long game, which is weird because you oftentimes think of the aggro deck as not wanting to be the deck that goes to the long game. But in old school, like decks like the deck tend to be very, very threat light. So oftentimes you can still kind of play a long game with them as long as they don't get a card engine online. And that's kind of where Disenchant comes in. Is Disenchant was designed and was intended in this game because I had 2 of them, from my opener. to basically disable any card advantage engine that they do get online over the course of the game. Now, as it turned out, they never did. They kind of kept within the range that we expected in their opener. That included probably a lot of point removal, one-for-one removal. And I think, you have to be fine when you're on an aggro deck like I'm playing, having your creature's point removed. But fine, but also patient with it because you know that, because you're playing 22 permanent sources of damage and realistically 28 business spells that actually win the game or kill your opponent, that eventually you're just going to overwhelm their answer cards because there just aren't as many answers. The answers are really, really, really good. They're far better than the threats are, but eventually they'll just run out of them because, 8/9 is not 22. It's just not. So eventually you're just going to draw more threats than they can handle. Now that said, they could time spiral or time twister rather their deck back together and then continually swords to plowshares your threats. But I don't think that's a winning strategy per se, especially when an aggressive opponent's making land drops every turn, because it's also true that I'll draw less lands. And draw more threats, ostensibly, possibly some disenchants. But over time, that's kind of like, how the deck's designed to win. It wins through density of threats. So the density of threats is higher than the good answers are in 93-94. So when you're playing versions of, like, the deck, you try to overwhelm them through mass. Now, there are certain cards that the deck runs that you have to be worried about, like Balance is one of them. The Abyss can be problematic, so can Moat. Balance is pretty tough, I'm not going to lie, but the Moat and the Abyss is why we're running Disenchants in here, so we can get around those, and I also have, 8 Flyers in the deck, plus a bunch of Bolts and Fireballs to kind of get around Moat. Sometimes folks will sideboard in, like, Red Elemental Blast, or not Red Elemental Blast, I'm sorry, Circle of Protection Red, which can be problematic for some of the burn spells, like Fireball here, or Lightning Bolts, or Chain Lightnings, but in general, you can tend to get around them. The other thing that I kind of like about this Jeskai build, or this blue-white-red build, over something more traditional like a Rug build with Curd Apes, is that it's not completely cold to a City in a Bottle. The Rug builds are probably independently better decks, but where I think they tend to fall short is that they rely very, very heavily on Arabian Nights because the threats from Arabian Nights are just so good. And because of that, you run into issues with, sideboarded in Cities in a Bottle or transmute into City in a Bottle and just, blow you out. That said, sometimes, they don't have it or they don't get to mana fast enough to stop you and you get them. But I think more often than not, you're going to find that the Rug decks are templated for a lot more than something like this Jeskai build is. That's kind of why I went about building it, and it's also more efficient. You're not running Urnum Djinns and stuff like that. So anyways, guys, hope you guys enjoyed the content. I hope, this helps kind of, showcase this interesting deck, this basically blue-white-red Jeskai all one-drops deck that I built, and also kind of gives you some thinking or food for thought on templating against Control in 93-94, because I do think Control is very beatable in 93-94. I just think that oftentimes, it takes more creative lines to come up with deck ideas that do it. And oftentimes those decks are not as good as the Control decks. They're good at beating the Control decks, but they're worse versus a wide meta. I.e. they're a predatory strategy as opposed to the best natural strategy in the format. But they can still get there. Anyways, guys, hope you enjoyed, and take care now.